All right, let's continue our study on how to use UDL, this time discussing what it means to provide multiple means of representation. So once again, this relates to research that's been done on the recognition network, highlighted in this image of the brain as being sort of the back big chunk of it in purple. So this is the what of learning, and this is how we recognize, perceive, understand information. Because we're all so different in the way our recognition networks work, the guideline from CAST is that you should provide multiple means of representation, different ways of presenting that information to students. Some general ideas that relate to representation, to the way that we present content. In my first icon here, I have an open book, kind of looks like a textbook, and that's because using text or even text with some relevant visuals is a form of presenting that information. And it's a form that might be very effective for some students, but very ineffective for others, particularly when you consider the other nuances that are involved in text. It has to do also with vocabulary, with the access to the text. Really goes back into a lot of our concerns about barriers to materials that we discussed before. Another image we have here looks sort of like a little icon from maybe playing a YouTube video, and that's relating to multimedia very generally. Some students respond very well to having that sort of audio-visual presentation of content. They can follow along visually and also listen. Another example is straight up visual content. And I'm representing that here with some different like graphs and charts. And that's because data visualization or mind mapping can be really effective ways to present content to some students. You might provide a lot of written text that covers a lot of facts and information, but if you can present that visually in like a pie chart or a graph, that then makes a lot more sense for students who are more visual learners. I have another icon here, and it's showing someone kind of doing a little simplified chemistry experiment in front of a student. And that's because real life demonstration can be really effective for some students. Being able to actually see how things work, how things happen, as opposed to just hearing someone talking about it. And lastly, I have a video game controller, because sometimes interactive content is what's really effective for students to perceive and understand information. Are they able to engage with it, explore it, do something with it? That can sometimes make it easier for them to understand it. Now, in each of these five, that might be someone's strength, but it could be someone else's weakness. Someone might respond really well to visual content, but not at all for others. Some have struggled with that visual content. And the same can be said for all of these. So consider the fact that we are all different in how we respond to these different types of representation. All right, so we're getting sort of that playbook out again, because what are the strategies that are going to help with that diversity of recognition networks? What's the game plan that we're going to come up with? And according to CAST, what you want to do is provide options for perception, for language and symbols, and for comprehension. So we're going to dive a little deeper into each of those. So let's start with pulling out that clipboard again and looking at what are the things we can check off as ways to provide options for perception. One way is to offer ways of customizing the display of information. So being able to allow students to change, font size, arrangement of screens, different things like that. Another is to offer alternatives for auditory information. So if a student struggles either because of an actual disability, let's say they're deaf, or just because they're not a great auditory learner, what are some alternatives for them to get that information, maybe in a written way, maybe in a very visual way? And lastly, we want to offer alternatives for visual information. So this is really the same kind of principle, but let's say someone is blind or visually impaired, or simply doesn't process things very well visually. What are the alternatives you can create for that visual information, whether that is audio description or creating transcripts that can be read by someone's screen reader, different things like that. Let's check off some of those boxes with a couple of examples. Well, you can provide captioning and transcripts, and you should provide captioning and transcripts for videos and other visual content. This might involve editing the YouTube auto captions if you upload videos to YouTube. It could involve locating or creating transcripts if you use something like infographics that can't be read well by a screen reader, or just might be difficult to understand for students who don't follow sort of the visual organization as well. Another example is to create content that can be customized whenever possible. And this is a little trickier to understand, but basically go beyond static documents. Instead, embrace HTML content, multiple formats, and interactive tools. So for example, you might be a fan of having PowerPoints. And there's nothing inherently wrong with PowerPoints, but that's just one form, and it's not a very customizable form. Same can be said for PDFs and Word documents. If you convey that content in other ways, such as VoiceThread like we're doing here, or HTML content, then students can control a little better how they're going through this. They can control size, they can control text, they can get assistive technologies to be able to assist with the document, with the information. Find out ways to make sure that your content can be customized when students need it to be. Right, let's pull our clipboard back out. Consider how you can provide options for language and symbols. Here are the strategies that CAST provides. You should clarify vocabulary and symbols. Also, clarify syntax and structure. Support decoding of text, mathematical notations, and symbols. All right, so all three of those I think are kind of related, and it's all about helping students understand the content you're giving with providing some extra information or extra strategies. So trying to think about, are there ways that you can link to glossaries? Are there ways that you can highlight or bold or create heading structures that kind of make people understand things a little bit better? Another strategy, promote understanding across languages. And that is both foreign languages as well as different languages within our own English language. Because as we all know, sometimes the same words mean different things to different people across the country, across generations, across cultures. So how can you try to make sure that you're promoting that understanding? Maybe using more words, maybe using explanations, trying not to be limited. The last strategy here is to illustrate through multiple media. And that kind of goes back to all those previous ones as well. Don't count on the one way of saying it as the one that's going to make sense to everybody, because we all interpret things differently. So how can you explain it in a couple different ways so that people understand what you're talking about? Off a couple more boxes with examples. So the first way you could do it is to verbally explain all your visuals. You might have picked up on that in my presentation so far. This strategy means that in your presentations, or really any other thing that you're doing that involves visuals, take the time to articulate what the visual is that's being used and why and how it's relevant. This has a couple reasons. Not only are you now becoming accessible to people who have a visual disability who can't see your visuals at all, but you're also highlighting a connection and a meaning that others might not have interpreted. I have on this screen a check inside of a square, and I've been explaining that it's because these examples are checking off ideas in our list. Now, some people might not understand it that way. They might see that check in a box and say, okay, does that mean right? Because it's green, and green usually means right. And that's not too far off, but it's not quite what I meant to say. Or they might be completely lost by it. Why is there a checkbox? And now it's become a distraction as opposed to a support to what I'm trying to say. You also want to make sure that you teach every concept in at least two different ways. This goes back to that multimedia. So think about the media that you could use. You got textbooks and readings, videos, audio podcasts, infographics. There's so many different ways to convey information. Try to always do at least two. So that way, if one doesn't click with one student, the other will. And what's great is that even if it clicked with the student the first time, having it another way is just going to be further reinforcement and help them learn it more deeply. Let's pull out that clipboard one more time and talk about what it means to provide options for comprehension. So the strategies that CAST provides are to activate or supply background knowledge. Don't necessarily rely on students being able to provide that in the same ways or in the same contexts. Also, highlight patterns, critical features, big ideas, and relationships. Again, if someone is new to the content or is struggling to understand certain things, being able to show them how different concepts relate to each other, how different events have connected to each other, that will help them be able to understand it more deeply. The third strategy here is to guide information processing and visualization. Think about how you can help students develop sort of mind maps and relationships in terms of how things connect together, how close they are to each other, how far they are from each other. And lastly, maximize transfer and generalization. It's so important to help them try to put those concepts or those skills into different environments from just the first one that you teach. It's pretty much useless if the only thing they can do is answer questions on a test, right? We all agree with that. We don't want them to just learn how to fill in bubbles. We want them to be able to apply those skills in other contexts. So you need to really intentionally maximize that transfer and that generalization. All right, let's check off a couple of those strategies with some of our examples. Use visuals to highlight organization and relationships. So think about incorporating mind maps, Venn diagrams, other graphic organizers that really highlight how information or concepts or events or people are related to each other, how they're organized to each other. Thinking about like those hierarchy charts, helping students make those connections they might not be making when the information is portrayed maybe just verbally or through sort of isolated pieces of information not together. Another example, provide prior or cultural information as needed for context. Explicitly state what previous concepts are connected to or foundational to this new information, and explain your references. Don't rely on students to necessarily have the same reference point for pop culture, for American history, for any of these things. And that's not just if they're from a different country. There's a lot of diversity within our own country, within what our different experiences are. I know I used to use Disney movies a lot when I taught English because it was a great sort of shorthand for looking at a narrative and being able to analyze it. Okay, what does this say about gender? What does this say about society's expectations? Different things like that. However, I found that I had to be careful because those Disney movies were not universally accessible. They were great for some students, but I needed to have some backup plans in place because there were some students who either weren't very familiar with Disney movies, didn't really understand them, didn't connect with that type of narrative, and realized that maybe I needed to look at some other ways. For example, analyzing a commercial. Some of the same rules apply, talking about what it's saying about characterization and stereotyping, and I can use that as an example that resonates better with some people. So that's about trying to sort of provide any context clues you need and explain any references you use, and don't rely on people having the same interpretation or the same background knowledge. Again, we have some great resources for this information. The National Center on Universal Design for Learning from CAST, and all of our icons used in the presentation are by FreePick via flaticon.com.